So another place where we can see the times and all that is in the logs. So if we go to the logs, here we see all of the searches that have been happening recently, and whenever there is a link in the time it's spent responding to us, we can click this link and it will take us to the trace of that exact request. Okay, so this is also a very nice feature. Now, looking at traces one by one, I mean, it's not that interesting, because what we want to know is what is the overall performance of our request handlers, right? Or the overall performance of our entire application. So in order to have a more high-level overview of what's happening and how our application is responding, we can go to these analysis reports. Okay, so let's click there and hit New Report. And here we can enter the first part of the URI or the URL that we want to analyze over. So let's say we want to analyze how our search request handler is working. So I'm going to open up another tab. Okay, so I want to analyze or aggregate the response times of all of these requests here, starting with /search, and see how those perform. And then we'll do the same for recipe. Okay, so I'm going to hit /search, and the HTTP method, I'm going to get all, even though it's really a GET request, HTTP status, we could filter out for each kind of HTTP status. But again, I'm going to do all. Report name, I'm going to call this search request handler v1, because this is version 1 of our application. And the model is going to be our default module, and the version is 1. And let's just hit last hour. And I'm going to hit submit. So it's processing, it's gone ahead and created a report, and the report is running, and when it will finish, it will let us know that it's finished. Okay, it's finished. So now we can go ahead, and by the way, if sometimes you get an error, you can get an error, and it will tell you that more than likely you don't have at least 100 samples in the report. So you need to provide a URL which has 100 samples, so 100 traces of that URL. So make sure you have that. So let's go in, and wow, here we see a graph. Okay, what does this graph mean? Okay, this graph is the distribution of the times of how our application responds to our users, okay? So we can see that there's a couple of users that are getting their request served in 8 milliseconds, then it falls a bit to 20, but overall there's the majority, the vast majority of the users are getting their requests being returned to them in some kind of, maybe, I don't know what this is because this graph isn't linear, but you can see it's slightly over 100 milliseconds, okay? So this is a very good response time for a search query. And here we can see the cumulative distribution. So here we see that on average, 75% of our users get their request responded back to them in under 100 milliseconds. This is a really amazing result, okay? And here, if we scroll down, I'm going to change the graph again here. And here, if we scroll down, we see percentiles, okay? So this is one thing that Google stands by very firmly, is that we can't just look at the average response time, okay? Because what's happening here is that the average response time may be, let's say, under 100 milliseconds, and you'll say, okay, 100 milliseconds as the average response time is a really good response time. Well, everything is working here. Well, that's not entirely true, because imagine we had this graph here, but at the very end, somewhere here in 1 second, we had a small peak here. So a small peak of users are getting a very bad experience, okay? So if the majority of our users are getting their request being turned back to them in 100 milliseconds, then there may be a very small percentage of users, maybe 5% of the users, who get their response returned to them in a much longer time than the average user. So this would be very bad. That's why we need to look at percentiles. Then averages don't matter here. We can't look at averages because averages tend to lie in these cases. Okay, so here we see that 90% of our users get their request returned back to them within 165 milliseconds. So this is, again, a very good result. And here we can even see App Engine tells us what our bottlenecks are. This is amazing. We can see that the bottlenecks are obviously the search, because, this is a very simple application and the only thing we're doing is using the search API. So really, we can't really fix this unless we found a way to optimize our search queries. Okay, so we could do that, for example, okay? And here it even gives us access to the logs of a couple of traces that produced this result of 90% of 165 milliseconds or this 119 milliseconds. So we could click here and we would go to the actual trace and see maybe why it took so much and so on and so forth, okay? And we can actually also go to the log of this trace. So here it has opened up the actual log of the trace that was returned in these 190 milliseconds, okay?